Welcome to our channel where stories of resilience and courage come to life. Today, we bring you the compelling journey of Tom and Anna Sullivan, whose drive to the hospital on a critical night turned into an unexpected fight for survival. What followed was more than a personal battle. It sparked a community movement that led to powerful changes reaching far beyond their city. What happened that night? How did it turn their world upside down and rally a town to their side? And how did their fight create ripples that changed policies and inspired others nationwide? Before we start, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that showcase the strength and impact of everyday people. Let's dive in. The city of Crest Hill pulsed with life as evening descended, painting the skyline with hues of orange and purple. The traffic crawled over busy streets as office workers trudged home, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. Inside their modest second-floor apartment, Anna Sullivan leaned against the kitchen counter, her fingers brushing absent-mindedly over the swell of her belly. The gentle kick that followed made her smile, despite the unease that had been simmering in her chest all day. "Tom!" she called, her voice echoing softly through the hallway. The muffled sounds of keys clicking and papers shuffling from the next room paused, replaced by quick, familiar footsteps. Tom Sullivan, tall with kind, perpetually worried eyes, appeared in the doorway, still in his paramedic uniform. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and he wore the tired smile of someone used to long days. He immediately noticed Anna's expression and crossed the room to her side. "Hey, what is it?" he asked, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. Anna took a deep breath, fighting the flutter of nerves. "I think it's time," she whispered, a mixture of excitement and apprehension threading her voice. Tom's eyes widened, the weariness in his face vanishing as adrenaline took its place. "Time? Are you sure?" His hand slid instinctively to her belly, feeling another kick beneath the fabric of her maternity dress. "Yes," Anna said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the shiver of pain that now rippled through her. She met his eyes, their shared understanding speaking volumes. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, discussing routes to the hospital, emergency contact numbers, and what to do if things didn't go as planned. But now that it was here, a small, treacherous voice in Tom's mind whispered that they weren't ready. He shook the thought away, focusing on Anna. "Okay, let's do this. The hospital bag is by the door, right?" Anna nodded, clutching the counter as another contraction made her wince. Tom guided her carefully to the chair by the dining table. The light from the overhead lamp caught the sheen of sweat on her brow, and he cursed himself for the half-second of panic he'd allowed earlier. "Stay here. I'll get everything ready," he said, already moving toward the front door where their hospital bag and keys waited. Within minutes, Tom had helped Anna down the narrow flight of stairs that led to the street, where their old sedan sat, its paint chipped and tires slightly worn. The city hummed around them with the sounds of passing cars and the chatter of pedestrians. A street musician's saxophone played a melancholy tune that seemed out of place against the urgency in Tom's steps. The streetlights flickered to life as dusk settled deeper, and Tom couldn't help but notice the deep orange glow reflecting off the windows of the buildings across the street. It was a detail that might have been beautiful in a calmer moment, but now it felt surreal, as if the world were mocking their rush. "Easy, Anna," he murmured, easing her into the passenger seat. She clutched his arm as another wave of pain tightened her body, her fingers digging into his sleeve. Tom held his breath until her grip loosened, and she exhaled shakily. "Tom," she whispered, the single word carrying both trust and fear. "I'm here," he said, buckling her seatbelt with hands that shook only slightly. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the car, the rumble of the engine vibrating through him like a pulse. He glanced at Anna, her face pale but resolute, and nodded. "We're going to be fine." As they pulled out onto the street, the city stretched ahead of them, a labyrinth of lights and movement. Crest Hill had always felt familiar, its blocks marked by mom-and-pop shops, parks where they had shared countless picnics, and the hospital where Tom had seen both hope and heartbreak in equal measure during his years as a paramedic. Tonight, though, the city felt different, as if it were shifting beneath them, watching and waiting. The streets were a mix of headlights and taillights, an orchestra of red and white weaving through the darkening sky. The hospital was only 10 miles away, but each traffic light they approached seemed to turn red as they neared. Tom gritted his teeth and checked the time on the dashboard, the numbers seeming to taunt him. Next to him, Anna's breathing quickened, and she clutched the armrest with white-knuckled determination. "Just breathe, just breathe," she repeated to herself, her voice trembling. Tom reached over and touched her arm lightly. "You're doing great," he said, trying to infuse his words with the calm he needed her to feel. But inside, worry gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. They reached a major intersection, the light turning green just as they approached. Relief flared, only to sputter out when a line of slow-moving cars crawled in front of them, blocking their path. Tom drummed his fingers on the wheel, feeling the seconds stretch into an eternity. A loud honk from behind jolted him back into action, and he maneuvered the car into the left lane, narrowly avoiding a cyclist who yelled in protest. "Sorry," Tom muttered, the apology lost to the night. "Tom!" Anna gasped, her voice tighter now, panic edging into her tone. "It's coming faster." He swallowed hard, glancing at her as sweat dripped down her temples. "Hold on. We're almost there," he promised, though the hospital still seemed impossibly far away. Just then, flashing red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror, and the whoop of a police siren shattered the tense silence. Tom's eyes widened, and he looked at Anna, who met his gaze with equal parts confusion and alarm. The cruiser behind them signaled for him to pull over, its lights reflecting off the darkened windows of the nearby shops. Tom's heart sank. Not now, not tonight. He eased the car to the side of the road, the engine idling as the officer approached. A tall man with a rigid posture and a severe expression, Officer Richard Gray, stepped up to the window. His uniform was perfectly pressed, the radio clipped to his shoulder, emitting quiet static. "License and registration," Gray said, his tone flat. "Officer, please, my wife is in labor," Tom said, gesturing to Anna, who let out a low moan as another contraction hit. Gray's eyes flicked to Anna, but his face remained impassive. "You ran a red light back there. I need your information." Tom's chest tightened, and he glanced at Anna, who was now gripping the door handle as if it could anchor her to the present. "Officer, with all due respect, we need to get to the hospital now," Tom said, struggling to keep his voice calm. Gray's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I need you to comply." Frustration flared hotly in Tom's chest. He knew that arguing would only waste more time, but every second they sat there felt like a theft. He handed over his license and registration, his hands trembling with anger and helplessness. As the officer walked back to his cruiser, the street around them seemed to close in, the city's familiar hum now an indifferent chorus to their plight. Anna's breathing turned into short, panicked gasps, and Tom reached over to take her hand. "It's okay, Anna. We're going to get through this," he said, the words more a plea than a promise. She nodded weakly, eyes squeezed shut as she fought the pain. But Tom could see it, the fear that had begun to seep in, filling the cracks where hope had been. Minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Tom craned his neck to see the officer talking into his radio, oblivious to the urgency crackling in the air. The sound of traffic moved sluggishly around them, and a few pedestrians glanced curiously at the scene, unaware of the stakes. A light drizzle began to fall, speckling the windshield with drops that caught the glow of the police lights and smeared it into streaks of color. The surreal beauty of it was lost on Tom as he felt the pressure in his chest build to a breaking point. Just as he was about to unbuckle his seatbelt and step out, the officer returned, his expression unchanged. "You need to be more careful, sir," he said, handing back the documents with infuriating slowness. Tom grabbed them, barely nodding before turning back to Anna, who was now panting through clenched teeth. "Hold on, we're moving," he said, starting the car with a jolt. As they pulled away, the officer's stern gaze followed them, unmoved by the scene he had just delayed. Tom's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he focused on the road ahead. The hospital was closer now, the red emergency sign flickering like a distant promise. "Almost there, Anna," he whispered, glancing at her strained face. But the fear that had gripped him earlier hadn't let go, and now it seemed to tighten with every turn, every passing second. The hospital's entrance loomed ahead, neon lights casting shadows that danced over the pavement. The moment they reached it, Tom slammed the car into park and ran to Anna's side, helping her out as medical staff rushed toward them. "Emergency C-section," Tom called out, his voice breaking as the weight of what they had just endured hit him like a wave. Anna's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. They were safe now, but only just. The sterile, bright hallway of County General buzzed with subdued urgency as nurses and doctors moved with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to emergencies. Tom stood just outside the surgical suite, the cold, disinfected air biting through the thin fabric of his shirt. The doors swung shut behind the team, pushing Anna's gurney, their voices blending into a jumble of medical terms and clipped instructions. He rubbed his hands over his face, the weight of everything settling into his bones. The drive had been harrowing, each minute feeling like an hour, and now that the moment had passed, the adrenaline began to seep out of him, leaving a shaky emptiness in its place. "Mr. Sullivan?" A nurse with kind eyes approached, her voice soft. "We're preparing your wife for surgery now. Someone will update you as soon as we can." Tom nodded, a response that felt automatic and detached. He looked down at the hospital ID badge clipped to his uniform, a reminder of how many times he had been on the other side of these hallways. This time, the waiting room wasn't a station he passed on his way to work. It was a purgatory where seconds felt like a test of his resolve. The door at the far end of the hall swung open, and James Carter strode in, still in his paramedic uniform, its creases showing the wear of a long day. His eyes scanned the room until they found Tom, narrowing with concern. "Tom," James said, moving closer and placing a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder. "How is she?" Tom swallowed, his throat dry. "They're taking her in now. They said they'll update me soon." He glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands ticking in a rhythm that mocked his impatience. "It shouldn't have taken this long, James. We were stopped by a cop of all people." James's jaw tensed, the muscle there tightening as he absorbed the news. "I heard something about it over the radio on the way here. They're talking about an investigation." The word felt heavy, unimportant in the immediate chaos of Tom's fear, but relevant enough to stoke the fire of his anger. He clenched his fists, his eyes hardening. That Officer Gray, he wouldn't listen. It was like talking to a wall. He saw her, saw the pain she was in, and he still— Tom trailed off, unable to finish. James exhaled, a slow, frustrated sound. "There's been talk about him before. Not official complaints, but enough that people know he's rigid." "Rigid?" Tom echoed, disbelief giving way to a bitter laugh. Rationalizing this kind of behavior as rigid is how things don't change. Anna almost— A nurse appeared again, cutting off his words. Her presence alone was enough to snap Tom's focus back to the present. "Mr. Sullivan, your wife is stable, and we're proceeding with the C-section now. We'll come out as soon as we have more news." Tom nodded numbly, the words, "your wife is stable," playing over in his mind like a lifeline he didn't dare release. James squeezed his shoulder once more, the touch a reminder that he wasn't alone. "Sit," James said, guiding him to the nearest chair. "You need to breathe." Tom let himself be steered, collapsing into the hard plastic seat. The air in the waiting room seemed to thicken with every breath, and he closed his eyes, forcing his mind to focus on the moments he and Anna had prepared for. The first cry, the warmth of holding their child for the first time. He clung to that image, fighting against the memories of flashing lights and a uniformed figure that stood between them and safety. The morning after Anna's surgery, the city woke to news of the night's events. Headlines appeared on local news sites: ambulance delay raises, questions about emergency protocols, and officer stops emergency vehicle, community demands answers. The footage captured by bystanders, blurry but unmistakable, showed the tension of the stop, the police cruiser blocking the road, Tom's panicked face visible through the windshield, At Crest Hill's precinct, Officer Linda Harper sat in a briefing room, a copy of the news article on her tablet. She'd heard whispers about what had happened before her shift started, but seeing it spelled out in stark print made it real. Captain Daniel Roberts entered the room, the usual calm on his face replaced by lines of worry. He nodded to the officers who stood as he walked in, a gesture of discipline that spoke to his leadership style. "Sit down," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The room fell silent as he set a folder on the table and looked around. By now, many of you are aware of the incident involving Officer Gray and an ambulance on an emergency call. This matter has escalated, and there will be an inquiry into the details of what occurred and why. The officers exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably. Linda's mind raced, connecting what she'd heard on the radio the night before to the faces she'd seen in the video. The Sullivans! The realization hit harder than she'd expected. "Officer Harper," Captain Roberts said, his gaze shifting to her, "I'll need you to assist in gathering statements. You're known for your impartiality, and we need clarity right now." "Yes, sir," Linda replied, the words strong despite the tangle of feelings in her chest. She'd known Gray for years, knew his penchant for sticking to the letter of the law even when common sense called for flexibility. But knowing someone didn't mean excusing them. Outside Crest Hill's community center, a group of neighbors gathered, the air charged with conversations punctuated by anger and disbelief. Among them was Paul Fields, a civil rights lawyer who had spent years advocating for better policing practices. He stood tall, with a calm that contrasted sharply with the emotions around him. A local reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Mr. Fields, what does this mean for the city? Do you think this will lead to significant changes?" Fields looked at the camera, his expression serious but composed. "This incident is about more than one officer's actions. It's a reminder that when systems fail to protect the most vulnerable among us, those systems must be challenged and changed. This isn't just about accountability, it's about ensuring that emergencies are met with the urgency and humanity they deserve." Tom watched from the hospital room where Anna rested beside their newborn son. Her eyes were closed, dark lashes brushing pale cheeks that had only just begun to regain color. The baby's small chest rose and fell in the cradle, each breath a quiet promise that life could continue despite the chaos. He turned back to the TV, the sound of Fields' voice giving him a sense of focus. This was no longer just their battle. It was part of something bigger, something that could shape the city for years to come. Anna's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "Tom?" He moved to her side, taking her hand gently. "I'm here." She opened her eyes, the fatigue there softened by a look of determination. "What happens now?" Tom squeezed her hand, the weight of the past hours settling into a calm resolve. "We tell our story, Anna, and we make sure they listen." The sunlight streaming through the hospital window cast long beams across the room, a welcome contrast to the artificial glow of hospital lights that had surrounded them for the past few days. Anna lay propped up against the pillows, her gaze fixed on the tiny bundle cradled in her arms. Their son, with a shock of dark hair and a peaceful expression, was oblivious to the turmoil that had surrounded his entrance into the world. Tom sat at the edge of the bed, the fatigue in his eyes softened by wonder. Every time he looked at their son, he felt the push and pull of relief and residual anger. He reached out, brushing a fingertip across the baby's tiny hand, which instinctively curled around it. A soft knock on the door broke the quiet. James stepped into the room, his uniform freshly pressed but dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. He offered a small smile as he approached. "How's everyone holding up?" "We're okay," Anna replied, her voice gentle. "Better now that he's here." James nodded, shifting his gaze between the baby and Tom. "I thought you should know. Captain Roberts has called for an official review. They're going to gather statements, review the footage. The pressure from the community is making them act quickly." Tom's jaw tightened, the anger he'd been trying to manage threatening to spill over. "Good. They need to answer for what happened. Gray needs to answer." James put a hand on Tom's shoulder, a steady presence in the storm. "They will. But you should be prepared. It might not be straightforward. Anna looked up from the baby, her eyes sharp with a clarity that defied her fatigue. Then we make sure it's not swept aside. If this is going to mean anything, we need to be ready to stand by our story. Tom squeezed her hand, a pulse of pride mixing with his gratitude. We will! Outside County General, the parking lot had become a meeting ground for reporters, activists, and concerned residents. The air buzzed with the hum of generators powering news vans, and the murmur of conversations punctuated by the occasional click of a camera shutter. Paul Field stood near the entrance, addressing a small group of community leaders and reporters. His voice was steady, each word chosen carefully. The question here isn't just what Officer Gray did, but why such a response was possible in the first place. What we need to see now is transparency from the department and a commitment to change. A woman with curly hair and a voice full of conviction stepped forward. Her name was Maya Bennett, a nurse at County General and a longtime community advocate. This isn't the first time emergency response has been compromised by protocol gone wrong, but it should be the last. The crowd murmured in agreement, nods passing between people who had come to support Tom and Anna, even if they had never met them. The shared sense of purpose was palpable, binding them in solidarity against a system that had shown its cracks. Linda Harper watched from the sidelines, hands in her jacket pockets. Her heart beat heavily, not with guilt, but with a sense of duty that had grown since the night of the stop. She knew she'd have to step forward soon to lend her voice to the call for accountability, even if it meant pushing against the unspoken code of loyalty that had ruled her career. A few days later, Tom and Anna found themselves back at the municipal building. This time, not as paramedics or patients, but as witnesses in an ongoing investigation. The building was a maze of white hallways and muted offices, with a waiting area that buzzed with quiet tension. Tom sat beside Anna, their son at home with Anna's sister, who had flown in as soon as the news broke. He kept glancing at the door, half expecting Gray to walk through, though he knew that wouldn't happen today. The officer had been placed on administrative leave, a decision announced in a curt statement from the department that had done little to assuage public sentiment. The door opened, and Captain Roberts appeared, his expression serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for coming in. We'll be conducting your statements separately, but I want you to know we're committed to getting to the bottom of this." Tom nodded, standing as Anna gave him a look of reassurance. "We're ready," he said. He was led into a small, sterile room with a single table and 2 chairs. A recording device sat in the center, its small red light blinking steadily. Officer Linda Harper entered behind him, carrying a notepad. Her presence was unexpected but somehow comforting. She nodded to Tom, a silent acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Roberts cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Tom, this is an informal session meant to gather your statement. I need you to recount everything that happened from the time you left your home until you arrived at County General." Tom exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment as if pulling the memory from a locked room in his mind. When he began, his voice was even, but the emotion was evident in every word. "We knew it was time. The contractions were closer, and Anna said she felt it was happening fast. I got her into the car, and we took off toward the hospital. Everything was going fine until we got to that intersection. That's when I saw the lights in the mirror." He paused, jaw tightening as the memory of Gray's face surfaced. Linda scribbled notes, her pen moving quickly. Captain Roberts leaned forward slightly. "Take your time." Tom swallowed, continuing. "He pulled us over and approached the window. I told him my wife was in labor, that we were trying to get to the hospital. He didn't care. He said I'd run a red light and demanded my license and registration. She was in so much pain, but he just stood there." Roberts exchanged a glance with Linda, who lifted her head and met Tom's eyes. "Did he acknowledge her condition at all?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "He looked at her, but he didn't act. He wouldn't even call for backup or let us go until he'd checked everything." Tom's voice shook slightly, but he steadied himself. "That delay could have cost us everything." Roberts nodded, his expression hardening. "Thank you, Tom. This helps us understand what needs to be addressed." Tom sat back, muscles tensing as if bracing for an argument that hadn't yet come. But the room was quiet, filled only with the low hum of the recorder and the scratch of Linda's pen. Across town, Officer Gray sat in an office reserved for internal affairs reviews, facing a panel of department officials. The man who usually exuded unwavering confidence now wore a tense expression, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His lawyer, a man with a sharp suit and practiced neutrality, sat beside him. "Officer Gray, you are aware of why we're here," one of the panel members said, leaning forward with a pen poised over a notepad. "The events of that night have raised serious questions about your judgment." Gray cleared his throat. "I was following procedure. The ambulance ran a red light. It's my job to ensure safety on the roads, even if it means pulling over emergency vehicles." "And when you saw the woman in labor, did you reassess your decision?" another member asked, her gaze sharp. Gray's mouth tightened, the muscles in his jaw flexing. "I made a judgment call based on what I observed. The EMTs were confrontational, and I felt it was necessary to maintain control of the situation." The panel members exchanged glances, the room heavy with unspoken tension. The inquiry had only begun, but the stakes were already high. Not just for Gray, but for the department he represented and the trust of a community now watching closely. Back at the hospital, Anna sat in the recovery room with their son in her arms, the soft beeping of monitors providing a soothing backdrop. Tom returned from the municipal building, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion as he walked through the door. "How did it go?" Anna asked, shifting to make room for him beside her. "It went," Tom said, managing a tired smile. "I think they're taking it seriously, but there's no telling how this will end." Anna looked down at their son, who opened his eyes briefly before closing them again in a sleepy yawn. "However it ends, we're not going to let this go. We can't." Tom nodded, feeling the truth of her words anchor him. This was their fight now, not just for themselves, but for the future. A future that included their son, and the hope that no one would have to endure what they did. As the day waned and the city's pulse softened into the quiet of evening, they held on to that hope, determined to see it through. Crest Hill was not known for protests. It was a city where change moved slowly, as if weighed down by decades of tradition and bureaucracy. But in the days following Tom's statement and the initial inquiry into Officer Gray's conduct, something shifted. The air was charged, electric with the collective determination of people who were no longer content to watch from the sidelines. It began with a few signs outside County General, hand-painted with bold letters that read, "Justice for Emergency Response," and "Protect Patients." Not protocols. The small gathering of friends and neighbors soon swelled into a crowd. Word spread through social media, local news outlets, and whispered conversations at cafes and community centers. The rally became a symbol of a greater call for accountability. Not just for Tom and Anna, but for anyone who had ever felt unseen by the systems meant to protect them. Tom stood at the edge of the growing crowd, holding Anna's hand tightly as they watched the scene unfold. James was there too, dressed in his civilian clothes, looking out over the sea of faces with a mix of pride and disbelief. "This is bigger than I thought it would be," James said, glancing at Tom. Tom nodded, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. "People want to be heard. I think this is their way of making sure they are." A makeshift stage had been set up in the parking lot, strung with portable speakers. Paul Field stepped up to the microphone, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Tonight, we gather not just to call for justice, but to demand change. No one should have to fight for their right to timely emergency care. We need policies that prioritize humanity over outdated protocol." The crowd erupted into applause, a swell of energy that resonated through Tom's body. Anna squeezed his hand, the corners of her lips turning up despite the weariness that still clung to her. "Look at them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're here because they believe this matter." Tom's eyes scanned the faces. Parents, medical workers, students, all unified in their insistence that this story be more than a cautionary tale, that it become a catalyst. The police department could no longer ignore the growing outcry. A press conference was called, a hurried affair meant to address public concerns before they swelled further. Captain Roberts stood behind a podium flanked by two senior officers. The backdrop bore the department's insignia, its polished emblem gleaming under the harsh lights of the conference room. "Good afternoon," Captain Roberts began, clearing his throat. His expression was firm but tinged with weariness. The Crest Hill Police Department acknowledges the concerns raised by recent events involving Officer Gray and an ambulance carrying a patient in critical condition. An investigation is ongoing, and we are committed to full transparency as we move forward. A reporter from the Crest Hill Times raised a hand. "Captain, does the department take responsibility for the delay that nearly jeopardized lives?" Robert's eyes flicked to the crowd of journalists, their pens poised, cameras ready. "We take these allegations seriously. This incident has underscored the need for a review of our procedures, particularly those involving interactions with emergency vehicles. We owe it to our community to ensure that such delays do not happen again." From her seat in the back of the room, Linda Harper listened, her face impassive but her mind racing. She had given her statement, recounting her decision to intervene that night. It had been a gamble, risking her standing among colleagues, but she knew it was right. Now, seeing Roberts publicly commit to changes felt like a step forward, albeit a tentative one. Officer Gray's hearing was set for the following week, drawing even more attention from the public. On the morning of the hearing, the city was unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Gray arrived at the municipal building, flanked by his lawyer and a few silent supporters. He wore a suit instead of his uniform, a visual shift that underscored the gravity of the situation. The hearing room buzzed with muted conversations. Tom sat in the audience beside Anna, James a few seats down. Linda entered moments later and took her place on the witness list. Her presence, a silent declaration of her intent to stand by what she believed was right. Gray's lawyer began his opening remarks, painting a picture of an officer who had acted out of a misguided but well-meaning adherence to the law. While we can all agree that emergencies require quick thinking, my client believed he was protecting the public interest, ensuring that even emergency responders follow protocol, he said, casting a sympathetic glance at Gray. The panel listened, their expressions revealing little. When Gray took the stand, he spoke with a controlled voice, recounting his version of events. He described the moment he saw the ambulance run the light, the decision to pull it over, and his interaction with Tom and James. "I acted as I believed I was trained to," Gray said, his voice flat. "I did not intend for any harm to come from my actions." Murmurs spread through the audience, the words sparking a mixture of disbelief and anger. Tom leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding himself back from shouting. When Linda was called to testify, she walked up with measured steps, meeting Gray's eyes for a brief moment before focusing on the panel. "I was there that night as backup," she began, "and I intervened because it became clear that Officer Gray's actions were no longer protecting the public but endangering them. A patient's life was on the line, and I couldn't, in good conscience, stand by." As the hearing continued, evidence was presented. Footage from bystanders, statements from medical staff about the potential impact of delayed care. The tension in the room was palpable, each new piece of evidence shifting the balance further. Gray's lawyer tried to redirect the narrative, emphasizing that emergency situations were complex and that officers were under immense pressure. But the argument felt hollow in the face of testimonies from people like Tom and James, who spoke not just of regulations but of humanity and judgment. By the end of the day, it was clear that Gray's actions, while perhaps rooted in a rigid interpretation of his duties, had crossed a line that could not be defended by procedure alone. Tom, Anna, and James stepped out into the late afternoon light, the air cooler now and tinged with the scent of rain. Reporters clustered nearby, their eyes scanning for reactions, but the trio kept walking, past the rows of parked cars and the murmuring crowd. "Do you think it'll be enough?" James asked, breaking the silence. Tom looked at Anna, who cradled their son against her chest. She met his gaze, a small, hopeful smile breaking through the fatigue. "It has to be," she said. We've done what we can. Now it's up to them." They stood for a moment, taking in the scene around them. People who had gathered not just out of curiosity, but to show support, to stand with them. It wasn't just about one night, one mistake, or one officer. It was about a city deciding what it wanted to stand for. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt something like hope settle into his chest, stubborn and steady. The final day of Officer Gray's hearing arrived with an air of anxious expectation. The municipal building was surrounded by clusters of onlookers and reporters, their voices blending into a steady hum punctuated by camera flashes. Signs waved above heads, bearing messages like "Justice for All" and "Emergency Care First," reflecting the city's divide on the case. Inside the hearing room, the tension was palpable. Every chair was filled, and people stood along the walls, their expressions serious. Tom sat beside Anna, their fingers intertwined, as if to draw strength from one another. James stood a few rows behind them, his arms crossed and eyes locked on the front of the room where Officer Gray waited to hear his fate. The panel's chairperson, Commissioner Sarah Hastings, cleared her throat and addressed the room. "After reviewing all testimonies, video evidence, and the sequence of events, we have reached a decision regarding Officer Richard Gray." A hush fell over the room, so profound that the rustle of paper in a distant corner sounded like a thunderclap. Gray sat motionless, his lawyer's reassuring hand on his arm, doing little to soften the rigid line of his jaw. While the panel recognizes the challenging nature of law enforcement duties, it is the conclusion of this inquiry that Officer Gray's actions constituted a serious lapse in judgment, Hastings continued, her eyes sweeping over the crowded room. His adherence to protocol without consideration of context endangered the lives of civilians. Effective immediately, Officer Gray is terminated from the Crest Hill Police Department. A ripple of gasps and murmurs swept through the room. Gray's expression didn't change, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. His lawyer leaned in to speak, but Gray's gaze was fixed ahead, unblinking. Further, this panel recommends that comprehensive training be implemented across the department to ensure all officers understand when and how to prioritize emergency medical situations, Hastings said. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This is to remind us all that the role of law enforcement is not only to uphold the law, but to protect life in every sense. Tom exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He felt Anna's hand tighten around his, the reality of their efforts sinking in. There was no sense of triumph, only a quiet, exhausted relief. Justice had taken a step forward, but it felt like the beginning of something, not the end. As people filed out, the reporters rushed to interview anyone connected to the case. James caught Tom's eye and approached, clapping him on the back. "They listened," he said, his voice low but sure. "Yeah," Tom said, a smile finally breaking through the layers of tension on his face. "They did." Linda Harper stood near the entrance, her eyes scanning the crowd until she spotted them. She made her way over, her expression softening. "You two did something important today," she said. "It's not just about one officer. It's about what this means for everyone." Anna nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. "It feels like a start." The crowd outside the building was a mix of reactions. Some cheered, others shouted questions or debated the fairness of the ruling. Paul Fields, the civil rights lawyer who had supported the Sullivans, stepped forward to address a gathering of reporters. His voice was clear and resolute. "Today we saw accountability. But now we must see action, real change that ensures no one is ever put in a position where protocol costs lives." Tom watched as Paul spoke, feeling a kinship with the man who had become an ally in their fight. His mind drifted to the future, to the changes that would need to follow this moment. Policies rewritten, trainings conducted, and most importantly, the conversations that had to continue. The decision sparked discussions across Crest Hill. Community centers hosted town hall meetings where residents could voice their thoughts, share experiences, and propose solutions. Schools and youth programs invited speakers to talk about civic responsibility and the importance of balancing authority with compassion. Linda Harper found herself at the forefront of a new initiative. tasked with helping design training sessions for officers on assessing emergency situations. The sessions were set to include input from paramedics like James and medical professionals who could explain the critical nature of response times. James stood before a room full of officers during the first session, the morning sun casting bright rectangles across the floor. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm here to help bridge the gap, because when we're out there, we have to trust each other enough to know when to step back and when to step up." The officers listened, some nodding, others maintaining impassive expressions. But the fact that they were there, that this conversation was even happening, was progress. Tom and Anna sat on their front porch one evening, watching the last rays of sunlight dip below the rooftops. Their son lay in Anna's lap, making soft, sleepy noises. The neighborhood around them felt different now, more alive with a sense of possibility. "Do you think people will remember?" Anna asked, glancing at Tom. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. "I think so, but it's up to us to remind them if they start to forget." Anna smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad we didn't stay silent." Tom pressed a kiss to her hair, his eyes drifting to the darkening sky. "Me too. We did the right thing." In the weeks that followed, the effects of the hearing continued to ripple through Crest Hill. Officer Gray's termination and the implementation of new training protocols became a blueprint for other cities facing similar challenges. The Sullivans received messages of support from across the country, stories from others who had faced delays in emergency care and felt inspired to speak up. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to Tom and Anna. It was from a paramedic in another city who shared that their department had begun reviewing its own policies because of Crest Hill's case. It was a small moment, but one that affirmed that change, though slow and sometimes painful, was possible. Life in Crest Hill began to settle into a new normal after the high-profile case of Officer Gray. The city buzzed with a mix of relief and reflection as conversations about emergency response and law enforcement became part of the public dialogue. For Tom and Anna Sullivan, each day was a reminder of how fragile life could be and how resilience could be built from the most challenging moments. The morning sun streamed through the living room window of the Sullivans' small house, casting warm patterns on the floor. Tom sat at the dining table, sipping a cup of coffee as he glanced over at Anna. She was bouncing their son gently in her arms, humming a tune that had become a soothing ritual in their home. The boy's giggles filled the room, a sound that seemed to cleanse the space of the worry that had once suffocated it. Tom set down his mug, the steam curling into the air. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" he said, breaking the silence. Anna looked up, her expression curious. "What does?" "Being here, just living without that constant tension. It feels like we've been holding our breath for so long." Anna's smile was soft, touched with the understanding that only they shared. "It does, but maybe it's time we learn to breathe again." Tom nodded, his heart warming at the sight of their son's bright eyes. The tension that had been their constant companion had lifted, replaced by a cautious hope. At Crest Hill's Community Center, a different kind of gathering was taking place. James Carter stood at the front of a room filled with first responders, community leaders, and police officers. A projector cast slides on the wall behind him, but it was his voice that held everyone's attention. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," James said, his tone firm but empathetic. "This is about learning to work together, to recognize the humanity in each crisis." I was there that night with Tom and Anna Sullivan, and what I learned is that sometimes understanding can save lives just as much as training. Officer Linda Harper sat in the audience taking notes. She'd seen James grow from a paramedic into a community advocate, and now he was speaking not just as a witness to a tragic event, but as a bridge between two professions that often misunderstood each other. James continued, pointing to a slide that showed statistics about emergency response times. "Seconds matter. If we can create an environment where first responders trust that law enforcement will act as allies during emergencies, we'll not only save time but lives." The audience responded with nods and the occasional murmur of agreement. The training session ended with applause, a signal that this was a step forward, however small. Linda approached James afterward, offering a handshake. "That was good," she said, her voice warm. "I think they're starting to see the bigger picture." James smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with genuine gratitude. "It's a start, and we'll keep going from here." Anna found herself at Crest Hill's local health center, joining a group of new mothers who met weekly for support. She'd been invited to speak about her experience, not just as a way of sharing her story, but to encourage others to voice their concerns and know their rights in emergencies. Being in that ambulance, feeling helpless, "It's something I wouldn't wish on anyone," Anna said, her voice steady. "But what I've learned is that speaking up, even when it's hard, can lead to change." A young woman with wide, nervous eyes raised her hand. "How did you find the strength to keep pushing for accountability, even when it felt overwhelming?" Anna took a moment, glancing at the baby sleeping peacefully in the stroller beside her. "It wasn't just me. It was Tom, James, Linda, everyone who stood by us. We found strength in each other, and that made all the difference." The room fell silent for a moment before filling with applause. Anna felt a deep sense of connection, knowing that sharing their story had rippled out into the lives of others. The City Council soon approved funding for new training initiatives that included joint simulations between police officers and paramedics. These drills aim to teach quick, decisive action in emergencies while emphasizing communication and respect for medical expertise. Tom watched one of these training sessions from the sidelines, feeling a mixture of pride and hope. He was there as an observer and advocate, invited to provide feedback alongside other community members. Linda, now part of the team leading the sessions, waved to him from across the room. "Looks like they're getting the hang of it," she said when she joined him during a break. "It does," Tom agreed, watching as officers practiced communicating with EMTs during a simulated emergency. The atmosphere was different now, collaborative, focused on solutions rather than barriers. Linda glanced at Tom, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You know, none of this would be happening if you and Anna hadn't spoken up." Tom's eyes softened, the weight of the past few months easing slightly. "We just did what we had to. But seeing this, it makes it worth it." At home, the Sullivans began to reclaim the life they had before that fateful night. They took long walks in the park, Anna pointing out every squirrel and bird to their son, while Tom pushed the stroller. Their evenings were filled with quiet moments, laughter, and the soft, contented noises of a baby discovering the world. One evening, Anna sat at the kitchen table with Tom, sorting through the letters they'd received since the case became public. Most were from strangers, words of support and gratitude for their courage. One letter in particular stood out. It was from a young woman whose mother had once been caught in a similar situation. She wrote about how their story had given her family the strength to seek change in their own community. Tears pricked Anna's eyes as she read it aloud. When she looked at Tom, his expression mirrored hers. Pride and the bittersweet recognition of what they had gained from what they nearly lost. "We did good," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Tom leaned over, kissing her forehead. "We did, and we're not done yet." The following months in Crest Hill brought a series of changes that were once unimaginable. What began as a rallying cry for justice and reform grew into an ongoing movement that reshaped conversations about emergency response and law enforcement practices. The Sullivans found themselves at the heart of this change, not by choice, but by a mixture of circumstance and resilience. The streets of Crest Hill looked almost the same, lined with familiar shops and bustling cafes. But something intangible had shifted. Conversations at coffee shops often turned to community safety, and the local newspaper ran stories not just about crime, but about initiatives being launched to strengthen trust between residents and first responders. The joint training programs between police officers and paramedics became a monthly occurrence, each one reviewed and refined based on feedback from participants. Linda Harper led many of these sessions, drawing on her experience and the lessons she had learned, standing at the intersection of protocol and compassion. One morning, Tom was invited to speak at one such training. He stood before a room filled with officers and EMTs, the buzz of quiet conversations silencing as he began. I was once in a position where I had to choose between following rules and acting to save a life. And it wasn't easy. I know that everyone in this room has been, or will be, in a similar situation. What I learned through my own experience, and what I hope you take away from this, is that judgment, empathy, and a willingness to act beyond routine can make all the difference. The room remained silent for a beat before the sound of applause broke out, hesitant at first, and then more confident. Officers exchanged looks, some contemplative, others nodding in agreement. Linda caught Tom's eye from across the room and offered a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. That evening, Anna stood in front of a packed room at Crest Hills Community Center. It had become a tradition for her to share their story and engage with parents, caregivers, and medical staff about their rights and roles in emergencies. The audience included a mix of faces: young parents cradling babies, medical students scribbling notes, and older residents who'd come to support the Sullivans and learn more about what had changed in their city. Anna began with the memory that still haunted her most: the helplessness in the back of the ambulance, knowing she was so close to help but not reaching it. There were moments I didn't know if we'd make it. But today, I'm here to tell you that speaking out, even when you're afraid, can be the most powerful thing you do. A young man in scrubs raised his hand. What would you say to someone who feels like they don't have a voice? Anna's eyes softened, and she glanced at Tom, who stood in the back holding their now-toddler son. You don't have to be loud to be heard, she said. Sometimes it's the quiet conversations, the shared stories, that start the biggest changes. The room fell into thoughtful silence, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. It was those moments, quiet but profound, that reminded Anna why they kept sharing their experience. If it gave even one person the courage to speak up, it was worth it. Later that week, Tom and Anna visited Paul Fields at his downtown office. The civil rights lawyer had become a friend over the past year, his passion for change fueled by the stories of families like theirs. His office was cluttered with legal briefs and framed photos from past community events, each one a testament to battles fought and won. Paul leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he looked at them. I've been approached by a few cities, asking how they can replicate what we did here. It's not just Crest Hill anymore. Your story is reaching places we never thought it would. Anna's breath caught, and she exchanged a glance with Tom. I never imagined any of this, she admitted. We just wanted to make sure no one else went through what we did. That's why it works, Paul said, a smile touching his lips. It's genuine. People see that, and they know it's real. The conversation turned to upcoming legislation that could mandate similar training protocols statewide. Paul outlined what it would mean: more rigorous emergency response guidelines and penalties for officers who delayed care without valid reason. Tom nodded as Paul spoke, the gears in his mind turning. If we need to speak again, if there's anything we can do to support it, just let us know. Paul leaned forward, his expression serious but full of appreciation. I will. But for now, just know that what you've done is bigger than this city. And it's just the beginning. The park where Tom and Anna had spent so many evenings now had a playground with bright, new equipment donated by community fundraisers. Their son, now a bundle of energy, toddled toward the swings with delighted squeals. Tom pushed him gently, the breeze ruffling the boy's hair as Anna watched from a nearby bench, her eyes filled with peace. How's it feels? She asked when Tom joined her, their son giggling as he swung back and forth. Tom followed her gaze, a small smile playing on his lips. It feels right, like we've come through something, and now we're on the other side. Anna took his hand, squeezing it gently. We've built something better, not just for us, but for him, she said, nodding toward their son. For everyone. The air was filled with the sounds of children playing, parents chatting, and the hum of traffic in the distance. It was ordinary and perfect, a moment that spoke of resilience, hope, and the quiet strength that had carried them through the hardest nights. A year later, the Sullivan family received an invitation to attend the signing of the new state bill mandating emergency response training and accountability protocols for all police departments. The legislation was dubbed the Crest Hill Act, in recognition of the city's efforts to address its failings and commit to change. As they sat in the crowded hall, surrounded by familiar faces, Paul, Linda, James, Tom felt a surge of emotion. It wasn't just about the bill or the speeches that would follow. It was about the journey that had brought them here, the moments of doubt, the pain, and the quiet victories that made this possible. When the governor finished signing the document, the room erupted into applause. Tom turned to Anna, who had tears glistening in her eyes. "We did it," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "No," Anna replied, a soft smile breaking through. "We started it." And as the applause echoed around them, they knew that those words held a promise to keep moving forward, to keep building on what they'd begun, and to never stop speaking up. With the passage of the Crest Hill Act, the city began to embrace its new identity, not just as a place that had faced a significant crisis, but as a model for meaningful reform. The change was gradual but visible in the day-to-day lives of its citizens, marked by renewed trust and a shared sense of responsibility. Crest Hill's town square, once the backdrop of heated protests and candlelight vigils, had taken on a new life. The same steps where people had stood with signs and shouted for justice were now the setting for community events. A mural had been commissioned and completed over the summer, depicting a scene of first responders and residents standing together, a symbol of unity forged through challenge. Tom and Anna walked through the square, their son toddling beside them, holding tightly to Tom's hand. The mural caught Anna's eye, its vibrant colors glowing in the afternoon sun. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Anna said, tracing the outline of a painted figure with her gaze. It was meant to represent a paramedic holding out a hand to a police officer, with a patient in the background looking hopeful. The message was clear. They were all in this together. Tom nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It's more than I could have hoped for." Their son tugged at his father's hand, giggling as he pointed at a dog playing fetch nearby. Tom and Anna shared a look of affection mixed with gratitude. This was the life they had fought for, a community that was safer, more aware, and willing to learn from its past. Inside the Crest Hill Police Department, Officer Linda Harper's desk had taken on a new look. A framed certificate of commendation for her role in promoting reform sat beside a stack of training manuals she'd been helping revise. She'd been appointed the head of a new task force dedicated to emergency response coordination, a role that brought together her years of experience and her drive to see things done better. As she prepped for an upcoming training session, Captain Roberts stopped by her office. The captain's usually serious expression softened with approval. "You've made quite an impact, Harper," he said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "The changes we've seen wouldn't have been possible without you stepping up when it mattered." Linda set down her pen, the praise taking her by surprise. "Thank you, Captain. But it wasn't just me. It was the Sullivans, James, everyone who refused to let this slip away." Roberts nodded, his eyes taking on a thoughtful gleam. "True, but leadership matters, and I want you to keep pushing. This isn't the finish line." Linda's smile widened, and she stood a little straighter. "I will." James Carter had also seen his role shift over the year. He'd been invited to participate in panels, share his experience at conferences, and collaborate with other cities looking to emulate Crest Hill's model. He approached these opportunities with the same dedication that had driven him to stand by Tom and Anna on that night. One evening, after returning from a conference in a nearby city, James sat at a local cafe with Tom. The dim lights cast a warm glow over the worn wooden tables as they sipped their drinks. "Hard to believe how far things have come," James said, stirring his coffee. "I spoke to EMTs today who said they'd heard about Crest Hill and were trying to bring some of the same practices to their departments." Tom leaned back in his chair, a grin breaking across his face. "It feels good to know that all of this, everything we went through, meant something." "It did. And it keeps meaning more," James said. "One of the paramedics I spoke to told me that their department now runs joint drills with local police. They used to run into the same issues we had. Protocols clashing, delays. But they're learning to handle it better. Tom nodded, pride swelling in his chest. It's the ripple effect. One small change led to another. James raised his mug, and Tom clinked his against it. To more changes, James said, a promise in his voice. To more changes, Tom echoed. The following spring, Tom and Anna received an invitation to attend a ceremony at Crest Hill City Hall. The mayor wanted to honor key figures who had contributed to the reforms that followed the crisis. They stood at the back of the hall, surrounded by familiar faces. Paul Fields, Linda Harper, and James Carter among them. The mayor took the podium, clearing his throat as he looked out over the gathered crowd. Tonight, we recognize that change is born out of courage, collaboration, and the willingness to act in the face of uncertainty. We celebrate those who, in the most challenging of moments, held firm to the belief that things could be better. The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt. Tom took Anna's hand, squeezing it as she blinked back tears. When the ceremony ended, people mingled, sharing stories and laughter. Linda approached them with a grin. "You ready for the next chapter?" she asked, half joking. Anna glanced at Tom and then back at Linda. "We're ready for whatever comes," she said. Over the next few months, Tom and Anna focused on their growing son and each other. But they stayed connected to the community they had helped galvanize. They spoke at events, offering insight not just as advocates, but as parents who wanted a safer world for their child. Their story became part of Crest Hill's narrative, woven into the city's history as a reminder of the power of resilience and collective action. One evening, as the sun set behind their house, Tom sat with Anna on their porch, watching their son chase fireflies in the yard. The sky shifted from deep blue to indigo, stars beginning to prick the horizon. "Do you think he'll remember any of this when he's older?" Anna asked softly, watching their son's laughter light up the yard. "Maybe not all of it," Tom said, his voice thoughtful. "But he'll know that we stood up for him, and he'll grow up in a place that's a little better because of it." Anna nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. The air was cool and smelled of cut grass, full of the simple, beautiful moments they had fought so hard to protect. It was the kind of evening that reminded them why it had all been worth it, why they would continue to push for what was right. They sat in silence, the past and future mingling in the quiet peace of their present. And as the fireflies blinked like tiny stars in the grass, they knew their story was far from over. The year following the signing of the Crest Hill Act was marked by growth, not just in policies and training programs, but in the culture of the city itself. Trust, fragile and tentative at first, began to take root. People felt emboldened to step up, not just in times of crisis, but in the everyday moments that held communities together. Crest Hill's Community Center became a hub of activity, as initiatives focused on bridging the gap between emergency services and the public took shape. Regular workshops were held where residents could learn about their rights during medical emergencies, and first responders shared what they needed from the public to do their jobs effectively. Anna took on a role as a community liaison, volunteering her time to lead discussion groups. One afternoon, she stood before a room filled with parents, teachers, and high school students. On the whiteboard behind her were the words, "What does safety mean to you?" "Before everything happened, I thought safety was something you could take for granted," Anna said, her voice steady but reflective. "But now I know that safety is something we create, together. It's built on understanding and making sure every voice is heard." A teenager in the front row, dark curls framing her face, raised her hand. "But how do we make sure things don't go back to the way they were before? People forget, and then it just becomes another story." Anna paused, looking out at the room with an expression that mixed determination and empathy. "We don't let it become just another story," she said. "We remind each other why it mattered in the first place, and we keep pushing for progress, even when it feels like it's slowing down." The room filled with nods and quiet murmurs of agreement. It was clear that Anna's words resonated, planting seeds of responsibility in those listening. Tom's role at the firehouse evolved, with the city assigning him to lead a task force focused on improving communication between emergency responders and law enforcement. It was a position that allowed him to channel the lessons from their ordeal into meaningful action. One morning he met with officers and EMTs in a training room at the firehouse. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rubber from the safety mats that lined the floor. Linda Harper stood at the back, observing with a mix of pride and curiosity as Tom began the session. "We're not here today to point fingers or relive old frustrations," Tom said, his eyes moving over the room. "We're here to talk about how we make things better. Emergencies don't come with instructions, so we have to trust each other to do what's right." An officer with close-cropped hair raised a hand. "But what happens when protocol conflicts with what we think is right in the moment? We're trained to follow rules." Tom nodded, the question familiar but crucial. "And those rules are there for a reason, but they're not infallible. What we need is the confidence to balance protocol with judgment. If you're faced with a choice between delaying an emergency response and ensuring public safety, collaboration is the key. It's not just your call, it's a team effort." Linda stepped forward, adding her voice. "That's why we're here, to build that trust. So, when the time comes, we can act as one, not as separate pieces trying to do the same job." The room buzzed with conversation as Tom stepped back, letting the group break into smaller discussions. Progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. The impact of the Crest Hill Act caught the attention of neighboring states, some of which sent representatives to observe the training programs and community workshops. Paul Fields worked tirelessly to ensure that these visits translated into legislative interest. His office became a revolving door of meetings with officials eager to learn from Crest Hill's model. One afternoon, Paul sat across from an aide to the state governor, explaining the key components of the new training initiatives. Charts and reports covered the large oak table between them. "It's not just about policy changes," Paul emphasized. "It's about fostering a culture where responders feel empowered to act in the best interests of public safety, without fear of reprimand for stepping outside the lines when it counts." The aide, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, nodded thoughtfully. "If we were to adopt something similar, what do you think would be the biggest challenge?" "Commitment," Paul replied without hesitation. "The commitment to keep the focus long after the headlines fade. It's easy to pass a law. It's harder to change how people think and act." Back at home, the Sullivan family continued to grow. Their son's second birthday was celebrated with a modest gathering at the park, attended by friends, colleagues, and community members who had become like family through the trials of the past years. A banner strung between two trees read, "Happy Birthday," flapping lightly in the breeze. James arrived with a gift in hand, a small wooden fire truck that he handed to the birthday boy with a grin. "Thought you might like a piece of what your dad does," he said, ruffling the child's hair. Tom laughed, the sound light and full of genuine joy. "You know, he already imitates the siren," he said, demonstrating with a playful woo-woo that earned a giggle from his son. Anna stood nearby, talking with Linda, who had brought her niece along. The scene was one of simple contentment, an embodiment of what they had fought for, the right to celebrate milestones without the shadow of what might have been. "You ever think about what we've done here?" Linda asked, gesturing to the group that now shared laughter and stories under the sun-dappled trees. Anna nodded, her eyes following her son as he toddled between guests, babbling in delight. "All the time, and I think we're just getting started." As the day wound down and guests began to trickle out, Tom and Anna sat on a picnic blanket, their son asleep in Anna's arms. The park grew quieter, the golden hues of the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. Tom looked out at the horizon, a sense of calm washing over him. "We've come so far," he said softly. Anna shifted their son's weight, a content smile on her lips. "And we'll keep going, won't we?" Tom took her free hand, squeezing it gently. "Always? For him, for us, and for everyone who believes that change is possible." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and the soft rustle of leaves, they knew that while the fight for progress was ongoing, they had built something strong, something that would stand as a beacon for those who came after them. The years following the Crest Hill Act witnessed a gradual transformation not only within Crest Hill, but across the state. The Sullivan family's journey, once a story of pain and perseverance, became a testament to what could be achieved when a community came together to demand better. One day, Anna received an unexpected call from a state senator's office. They were organizing a summit on public safety and emergency response reform, and they wanted her and Tom to share their story as keynote speakers. The event was set to take place in the state capitol and would be attended by lawmakers, first responders, and community advocates from across the region. Sitting on their living room couch, Anna glanced at Tom, who was watching their son build a tower of blocks on the rug. "They want us to speak," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of surprise and anticipation. "At the summit next month." Tom turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Us? Really?" Anna nodded, a small smile forming. "I think it could make a difference. Show people that this isn't just policy, it's personal." Tom's eyes softened as he considered her words. "Then let's do it." The days leading up to the summit were busy. Tom and Anna worked on their speech during the quiet hours after their son was asleep, poring over drafts at the dining table. They wanted to convey more than just the facts of their ordeal. They wanted to share the lessons that had emerged from the struggle and the importance of continuing to push for better policies. James stopped by one evening to lend his support, pulling up a chair and reading through their notes. "This is powerful," he said, tapping the page. "You're not just telling your story, you're reminding them why it matters." Anna looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you, James. You were there when it mattered most." James waved a hand dismissively but smiled. "I did what any friend would do. But now, you're giving this moment a voice that reaches farther than we could have imagined." The state capitol's civic center was grand, with high ceilings and rows of seats that stretched to the back of the hall. The stage was set with banners that read, "Public Safety and Progress, Lessons Learned and Paths Forward." The audience was a mix of officials in crisp suits, first responders in uniform, and community leaders in business casual. Tom and Anna sat in the front row, waiting for their turn. The senator who had invited them took the podium, his voice carrying confidently through the hall. "Today, we gather not only to discuss the logistics of safety, but to remember the human stories that push us to do better. Please welcome Tom and Anna Sullivan, whose journey has inspired reform and reflection." The applause was warm and encouraging as they walked to the podium. Tom adjusted the microphone, clearing his throat as he began. "Thank you for having us. We're here today not just to revisit a difficult time in our lives, but to share why it's important that we keep pushing for changes that make our communities safer for everyone." Anna stepped forward, her voice steady as she took over. "When our story began, we were just parents-to-be, excited and anxious about the future. But one night changed everything. It reminded us how fragile life can be, and how quickly trust in the systems meant to protect us can break down." The room was silent, absorbed by their words. "Thanks to the support of our community and the courage of those who stepped up," Tom continued, "we turned that night into a catalyst for change. But what we learned is that change is ongoing. It's something that requires commitment, not just from lawmakers and first responders, but from everyone." After their speech, the room erupted into applause. Several officials approached them with questions, eager to learn how similar measures could be implemented in their own cities. Paul Fields, who had traveled to attend the summit, clapped Tom on the back with a broad smile. "That was exactly what they needed to hear," Paul said. "You've reminded them that reform isn't just theoretical. It's about real people and real consequences." Linda Harper, who had also attended, approached with a sense of pride. "Hearing your story today, it brought everything full circle. It's why I keep doing what I'm doing." Tom smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "We all played a part in this. And seeing it inspire others, it's worth every hard moment we faced." The Sullivans returned to Crest Hill with a renewed sense of purpose. Their story continued to be shared, serving as a lesson and an inspiration. The local news featured stories about neighboring towns adopting similar protocols, crediting the reforms back to the Sullivans' resilience and the community's commitment to growth. Tom's role at the firehouse expanded as he was asked to participate in statewide emergency response workshops. Anna kept her position as a community liaison, facilitating discussions that encouraged residents to speak up about their experiences and concerns. Together, they became symbols of what could happen when ordinary people refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the town in hues of orange and pink, Tom and Anna sat on their porch. Their son played on the lawn, his laughter filling the air like a song. Anna reached for Tom's hand. "Do you ever wonder what life would be like if that night had gone differently?" Tom's gaze was distant for a moment, but then he turned to her, eyes clear. "Sometimes, but I think about what came from it, how we found our voices and helped others find theirs. It doesn't erase what happened, but it gives it meaning." She nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "We're lucky to have found that, and to have each other," Tom said, leaning over to kiss her temple. Their son ran up, holding a small flower he'd picked from the edge of the yard. He offered it to Anna with an innocent smile, unaware of the weight those simple gestures carried. She took it, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, tucking the flower behind her ear. In that moment, with the sound of crickets beginning to chirp and the cool breeze of evening settling around them, the Sullivans felt a sense of peace that only came from knowing they had faced the storm and come out stronger. The Sullivan story continued to inspire, reaching new audiences through interviews, podcasts, and speaking engagements. It became clear that their journey was more than just a local triumph. It resonated with people who believed in the possibility of systemic change driven by personal courage. One afternoon, an envelope with an official seal arrived in the mail. Anna's eyes widened as she opened it, scanning the printed words quickly. She turned to Tom, who was helping their son piece together a jigsaw puzzle on the floor. "It's from the State Commission on Public Safety," Anna said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "They want us to be part of a panel to discuss reforms at the national conference next month." Tom's eyes widened in surprise. "A national conference? That's huge." Anna nodded, a smile breaking across her face as the reality of it set in. "They think our story could help guide discussions on creating standardized protocols for emergency responses." Tom stood up, a mix of pride and nervous energy in his eyes. "Looks like we're taking this beyond Crest Hill." The weeks leading up to the conference were a flurry of preparation. Tom and Anna worked late into the night, drafting speeches that highlighted their personal experiences and the policy changes that had followed. They wanted to strike a balance between sharing the emotional reality of their ordeal and the tangible lessons that had emerged from it. James joined them for a brainstorming session one evening, sitting at their kitchen table surrounded by stacks of paper and half-empty coffee mugs. He glanced over a bullet point list, nodding thoughtfully. "This is good," he said. "Make sure to emphasize the human impact. How the delay that night didn't just break protocol, it put lives at risk." Anna rubbed her temples, exhaustion tugging at her. "It's so hard to relive it, but if it helps make a difference, we have to." Tom reached out and took her hand. "We do, and we will." The day of the conference arrived, bringing with it a nervous excitement that buzzed through the convention center. Delegates, police chiefs, EMTs, and policymakers from across the country filled the large auditorium, their badges reflecting the light of overhead chandeliers. Banners hung from the ceiling read, "National Safety and Emergency Reform, Bridging Gaps and Building Trust." Tom and Anna sat in the green room, their speech laid out on the table between them. They could hear the muffled sound of the current speaker finishing up, applause echoing through the walls. Anna took a deep breath, looking at Tom. "Ready?" "As ready as we'll ever be," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. Their names were called, and they walked onto the stage, greeted by warm applause. Tom began, his voice clear but touched with emotion. "Our story started on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of our lives, the day our son was born. But it turned into a fight for his life, and ours, because of a series of decisions that prioritized protocol over urgency." Anna took over, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. What we learned from that experience is that when systems fail to adapt to human needs, they stop serving their purpose. We've worked with our community to create changes that ensure emergency services can do what they're meant to: save lives. But this isn't just about Crest Hill, it's about making sure this never happens anywhere else. The room was silent, eyes fixed on them as they spoke about the reforms that had followed, the training programs that had bridged gaps, and the shared determination that had kept them moving forward. After their speech, the room erupted into applause, louder and more sustained than before. Delegates approached them with questions, their interest piqued by the idea of implementing similar measures in their own cities. A woman with silver hair and a badge that read Chief A. Ramos, Seattle PD, extended her hand. "I want to thank you both," she said, her voice sincere. "Hearing your story puts faces to the policies we discuss in meeting rooms. It makes it real." Tom's heart swelled with pride as he shook her hand. "That's why we're here. To remind everyone that behind every decision, there are real people affected." Paul Fields joined them, having attended as a guest speaker on civil rights and public policy. He looked at Tom and Anna with a satisfied smile. "You did more than share a story. You lit a fire. I've already heard people talking about the need for national standards based on Crest Hill's model." Anna exhaled, the tension that had gripped her all morning finally releasing. "That's what we hoped for." When they returned to Crest Hill, the city felt different. Not because it had changed, but because Tom and Anna had. They had stood in front of the nation's leaders and told their truth, and it had resonated. Linda Harper met them for coffee, eager to hear about the conference. "So, how did it go?" she asked, leaning forward with anticipation. Anna's smile was warm. "Better than we could have imagined. People are listening. They want to learn from what happened here." Linda nodded, a glint of pride in her eyes. "Good. It's about time." Word of the Sullivans' speech spread quickly, sparking discussions in cities across the country. News outlets highlighted their appearance at the conference. Interviews followed, and their story became a case study in training programs and university courses focused on emergency management and public safety. One afternoon, Anna received an email from a college student studying public health. The message was short but heartfelt. "Hearing about what you did inspired me to switch my major to emergency response advocacy. Thank you for showing me that one story can change so much." Tears pricked her eyes as she read it. She called Tom over, sharing the words with him. He smiled, resting his chin on her shoulder as he read. "Looks like our story isn't just a memory," he said. "It's a guide for others." Years later, Crest Hill continued to thrive under the policies inspired by the Crest Hill Act. The town became a leader in emergency response training, often hosting seminars that attracted attendees from across the country. The Sullivans remained active in community affairs, their story serving as both a warning and an inspiration. Tom and Anna knew that while their journey had started with a single night of fear and urgency, it had evolved into a life dedicated to advocating for what was right. It was a legacy they could pass on to their son, who, though still young, would one day understand the story that shaped his family, and, in some ways, his town. As the sun set over Crest Hill one evening, casting a golden glow across the streets and rooftops, Tom and Anna sat on their porch. The echoes of their story were woven into the town's identity, reminding everyone who knew it that ordinary people could make extraordinary changes. And in that quiet moment, they knew they'd continue to stand up, speak out, and fight for a future where trust, safety, and compassion weren't just ideals, but reality. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content that focuses on resilience, advocacy, and community, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and empower. Your support helps us continue sharing impactful narratives. Thank you for watching.